weekend. I don't know if any of you have 8 o'clock classes on Monday, but I do, and they're really hard to get into the swing of things just because my mind is not really here yet. Still kind of on the weekend. It does take a little while. I think my mind is here now finally. I hope yours is as well too. Today we are going to finish our discussion on intervals. And then I believe next class on Wednesday we can start talking about triads, which is a little more interesting to me, especially because you usually deal with 3 notes instead of just 2. But I've got your homework returned to you, so I'm caught up on that. And you do have pages 9 and 10, a little bit of 10 for me today out of your workbook. So if you're looking ahead on the assignment sheet, you will probably notice that you will need page 10 to complete for Wednesday's class. And for most of you, again, page 10 is on the back side of page 9. So that means I cannot collect page 9 and 10 today, but I will be collecting both pages 9 and 10 in class Wednesday. Okay? And I can go back and I can check all the sections, that you've done for page 9 when I collect it on Wednesday. Now, despite that, I would like to give a little bit of time to see if anyone had any questions about some of the problems you had on page 9 and or 10. Okay, I see.
In section C, I was just wondering if we could review, I don't care which one of the augmented or diminished. I just need a review on that because my brain kind of forgot.
Okay, maybe I could do number 13 in section C. That's an augmented interval. Okay. Let's maybe use the space that I have right here. So in section C, you were supposed to notate the specified interval below the given note. And in number 13 in section C, you're in the bass clef. And you're given an A sharp, it looks like. Yeah. Okay. And we need to know what note is below an A sharp at the distance, exact distance of an augmented sixth. So like last week, what I would probably do is I would find the inversion of this interval above the given note.
Diminished third.
Yes, a diminished third is an inversion of an augmented sixth. That's right. Okay? So for me to spell a diminished third above an A sharp, first of all, I would need to know that A sharp to C double sharp is a major third. That is a major third. So if I lower the C a half step and reduce the space between those 2 notes by a half step, then I would have C sharp, single sharp, and that would be a minor third. That would be a minor third. But we're looking for a diminished third, correct? Because that's the true inversion of an augmented sixth. So I have to lower the C sharp even one more half step to take out another half step of space between the notes. So really, C natural produces a diminished third above an A sharp, which means I can take the C natural and drop it an octave. And that means then the C natural is indeed an augmented sixth below an A sharp. And that would be my final answer for that one. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Good. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I think I have the right answer, but I still kind of want to be walked through the process on number 16 on C.
Okay, number 16. You bet. We're still in the bass clef. And it looks like we're given a C flat. And we're asked to find the note a minor third below a C flat. Okay? So, again, if I use the inversion principle and I find the note that is a major sixth above, that should give me the exact pitch I need. With the right accidental and everything, I would just need to drop it So a major 6 above C flat is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's going to be some sort of A. And if I can actually think of a C flat major scale to confirm what note is a major 6 above, because we do have a C flat major scale in our system of music. And I know that in the C flat major scale, every note is flat. It contains all 7 flats. So that must mean that A flat is a major 6th above a C flat. Which leads me to conclude then that my final answer must be A flat, therefore has to be a minor third below the C flat. Does that help?
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I hope just by going through the process and thinking it through, talking it through helps. You just verify and confirm. Yes.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that I did number 15 right. I want
Okay.
to make sure I understand the process now.
Okay, number 15. We're starting with a G given to us. And we're supposed to find the note that's a diminished fifth below. I could actually see you doing this two different ways, and both ways would get you the same answer. For example, I know that a perfect fifth below a G is playing C. I know that. I mean, this isn't the way we necessarily talked about how to do it, but I know that G down to C, both natural, that's a perfect fifth. So what would I have to do to the C if this is a perfect fifth to make the distance between these two pitches just a half step smaller? Raise the bottom pitch, that's right. So really the answer is going to be C sharp is a diminished fifth below a G. If you want to do it the inversion way, which is certainly fine, that'll get you the same answer, you just have to ask yourself, what note is an augmented fourth above a G? And you should still get a C sharp. And then what you would do, since this is an augmented fourth above G, I know then that the C sharp down here would be therefore a diminished fifth below a G. But again, that kind of goes back to, and again, some students forget that. If I know, for instance, that this distance here is exactly a perfect fifth, then to get a diminished fifth interval or that much space, I need to shrink the amount of space between these two notes by a half step. And to shrink these two notes, the space between these notes by a half step, and I can't flap the G. Don't try to do that, because that'll be marked wrong. You have to leave the G as it is, it's given. Then what I have to do is I have to raise the bottom note a half step, and that'll give me a half step of less space than a perfect fifth. So, either way you slice or dice it, supposedly, you still get C sharp has to be the final answer. Good. Let's see, how much time we got here? Yeah, I think I got time for another question if someone has another question. If you don't, that's fine. But, did you all make sure you did all of section B, which was only 8 problems, quick problem. And then for section C, you did 11 through 20 and 31 through 40. If you did additional ones, that's fine. It's not going to hurt you, you just get extra practice. Very well, then hang on to page 9 and 10. Again, you'll need to complete page 10 for Wednesday. And that is section D, all of it, and section E, all of it. We'll get to that towards the end of class. I hope you are finding your way through intervals, and that manipulating intervals and spelling them is getting a little bit easier the more you practice them. Just because spelling intervals is a basic, absolutely fundamental task that we do all the time in music, and we use that knowledge pretty much every day after we get intervals under our belt. So today, as I said, I want to close or finish our discussion on intervals. And that means I'd like to talk about two main things. First of all, I'd like to talk about simple intervals versus compound intervals. And the good news is, this has nothing to do with simple meter versus compound meter. It's completely different. Even though I know that was your favorite part of this semester and always will be. But, okay, so simple versus compound intervals, and then after that I'd like to talk to you about enharmonic intervals. And there really is no reading in your textbook, in the chapter on intervals, there's no reading about enharmonic intervals. The book does not treat that. So the information you get on enharmonic intervals will have to be all from this class. And I think there's only like one or two sentences in your text reading about simple versus compound intervals. So again, the majority of what you understand and learn about those, I'd like you to get from this discussion today. So it's a good thing that you are all here. Okay, so let me start by saying, unfortunately, there is not agreement on this, a statement that I'm going to say between theory textbooks. Some theory textbooks will say one thing and other theory texts will say another. But I believe that intervals that are an octave or smaller are referred to as simple intervals, and any intervals larger than an octave are referred to as compound intervals. So I'm going to say that the simple intervals are those octave and smaller. And we'll classify the intervals that are larger than an octave as compound intervals. Now, I've looked, and it's funny, but some theory texts will actually place the octave in the compound interval column. And other theory texts say that the octave is considered a simple interval. So I'll never quiz you on that. Don't worry about that. The octave, I guess, some people think it's compound, some people think it's simple. It doesn't matter, right? The world still goes on and life continues. Okay, so but for this class, let's just say the octave is a simple interval and everything smaller than that is referred to as a simple interval. Okay, we are pretty familiar, hopefully, with these types of intervals. We've been dealing with unisons and seconds and thirds and fourths and fifths and sixths and sevenths and octaves. Okay? We've had a lot of practice dealing with and spelling the simple intervals. But we have not really addressed intervals that are larger or bigger than an octave. And those intervals are called compound intervals. And I think a good way, or one way to understand compound intervals, is to think of them as a simple interval with an additional octave of space between the notes. Okay? So over here, in this measure, I have C to G, which is a fifth. I'm not worried about the modifier just yet. If I add an octave to a fifth, then the total distance spanned is really from C in this example all the way up to this high G, right? So if I'm adding a fifth plus an extra octave of space, I get this total distance. Does that make sense to you so far? Now, the question is, what is the numeric size of this ginormous interval here? This interval that is larger than an octave. Well, we can count letter names span, pitch letter names. We can count staff lines and spaces. Do you know what it is?
The 13th?
Actually, no, it's not a 13th. But I can understand why you might think that. If we count, we'll count the C ledger line as 1, the space is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and the top space is 12. So it turns out that when you add an octave to a simple interval, we get fuzzy math. If you add an octave to any interval, the resulting numeric size is always going to be 1 less than you expect it to be. Another way to say that is when you add an octave to an interval, you can just fairly and safely add the number 7 to the simple interval to get the compound interval. And I'll try to show you why that is. So once again, adding an octave to a simple interval will always give you a size that's one less than you would expect it to be. Another way to get that is to always add 7 to a simple interval, and that will put an extra octave of space in and give you the right numeric size. Now you might say, what's the reason for this fuzzy math? Why do I add 7? Or why, in this case, is a fifth plus an octave a 12th and not a 13th?
Because they both share one note.
Yes, okay, good, you're spotting it. If I count the distance from here all the way up to here, I'm only counting this staff line once. But if I count these two intervals, the fifth and the octave, separately, I'm counting this staff line that the G occupies, I'm counting that twice. Okay, see, if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I count this staff line again for this G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's why I have a fifth plus an octave. But when I do the entire distance without interstop or any pause along the way, is just straight through and I count this staff line once, and so I get a total distance of a 12th. Okay? So I realize it's a little fuzzy math, but for compound intervals, just think of a simple interval with the same notes, take an octave out of it, and then add 7 to it, and you'll get the right number of the numeric size that you need. Let's start. Well, no, before I do that, let's do this. So, in terms of compound intervals, let me put it over here actually. In terms of compound intervals, what would a second plus an octave yield in terms of an interval size? Not what you expect.
9.
A ninth, that's right. So one compound interval is a ninth. What happens when we add a third to an octave, or an octave to a third? We end up getting what's called a tenth in music. A fourth plus an octave, believe it or not, gives us an 11th in music. A fifth plus an octave gives us a, what did we get over there, a 12th, right? A sixth plus an octave gives us a 13th. A seventh plus an octave gives us a 14th. And finally, this doesn't seem to make sense, and I understand why, but what happens, what do you get, what interval do you get when you add two octaves together?
15.
A 15th, not a 16th, that's right. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen any music, sung any music, or played any music. I mean, you're most likely to see it in piano music, but sometimes you'll see some notes on the treble staff, and above them you see something like it says 15 MA, or some kind of symbol. That means you're supposed to play those notes 2 octaves higher than written. The 15 representing the double octave. Right? Learn something new every day. Maybe it makes a little more sense now. Maybe it does. But so these are our compound intervals. 9ths, 10ths, 11ths, 12ths, 13ths, 14ths, and 15ths. We don't need to go any further than that. I have, I don't know why I'm thinking about this now, but I have a sign that's posted on my office door. And the title of the sign says, 50 Reasons You Might Be a Theory Geek. And one of those reasons would be, it says you might be a theory geek. You might be a theory geek if you know how big an interval of a 23rd is just off the top of your head. I don't. I would have to count that one out. But, I mean, theoretically, you can just make larger and larger and larger and larger intervals. If you know how to spell a 23rd off the top of your head, good for you. You might be a theory geek. But anyways, these are the only ones we'll deal with, 9th through 15th, the double octave. Okay, now, before I go any further, let's go ahead and identify, I've got these up on the board. Let's identify just the numeric size of these four compound intervals. Don't deal with modifiers yet, just the size. So the first one, f up to g. Now, if you want to do it the long way, that's fine. You can count lines and spaces, and you'll find out that f up to that g is a ninth. But what I tend to do to make it go, I think it goes a little quicker, is just imagine this f an octave higher on this line. If I put the f right there, what interval is that? That's a second, right? Well, what is a second plus an octave? Another. And it doesn't matter which way you go. For instance, you could take this G, the top one, and imagine it an octave lower. Right there. So F to G is still a second, and a second with an extra octave of space is always a ninth. You see how I can get that? Okay, so who can tell me what the interval size, or just the quantity of this next interval is?
10.
Yeah, it's a tenth. Do it whichever way you'd like. If you want to think of the E an octave higher, E to G sharp is a third. A third plus an octave is a tenth. Or think, bring the G down in your mind. Bring it down to this line. That's where the G sharp would be. E to G is a third. It's got an extra octave of space added in, so it becomes a tenth. It is a tenth. Somebody else, who wants to give me an numeric size for this one? D flat up to a really high G flat.
Is it an 11?
It is, it's an 11th. And the last one, probably no big surprise, it's really got the same note letter names as these, so it's a 12th. This one's a 12. Now, the final piece of information that you'll need to understand and identify compound intervals is how do the modifiers or the quality of the compound intervals work? Well, I'm glad you asked, right? The quality of a compound interval is the same as the quality of its corresponding simple interval without the nth octave. Seconds can be major, minor, augmented, or diminished, right? So ninths, therefore, are major, minor, augmented, or diminished. What were our perfect intervals, right? Besides the unison, wasn't there a perfect fourth, fifth, and octave? That means that 11ths, 12ths, and 15ths can be perfect, but not major or minor. 11ths, 12ths, and 15ths will be perfect or augmented or diminished. They would be on that, you remember that chart where I had the scale with the perfect, augmented, and diminished? Fourths, these ones here, fifths, octaves, these work along that same scale over on the left with the perfect, augmented, and diminished. All the rest of these intervals, the 7th, the 6th, the 14th, the 13th, the 10th, and the 9th, all those will be on the right side of the chart. They can be major, minor, augmented, or diminished. They have 4 stages, 4 types that they can be. So I know it can be confusing, but try not to ever say that, hey, look, there's a major 12th. No. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because 12ths can only be perfect, augmented, or diminished. Okay. So, let's go ahead and now identify, well, yeah, I'll just put a few more up here. Let's try this. This time I'd like someone to identify the interval name, the whole kit and caboodle. Not only the size, but also the quality, the modifier. And again, what I would do is I would either imagine this A an octave higher, right there, or imagine the B flat an octave lower. If I imagine the B flat an octave lower, it would sit right there on the middle staff line. And I know A to B flat is a minor second. Do you see how I get that? So therefore, this interval must be what?
A minor 9.
A minor ninth, that's right. There you go. Because without the extra octave of space in there, I had a minor second. Then the quality is identical, it's still the same, the modifier is minor, I just have to add the octave to get the different size. Okay, let's try another one here. I guess it's different than that. D up to F sharp. Name that interval. What's the, if you took an extra octave of space out of that space, that interval, what would the simple interval be? D to F sharp. Okay, so that's the compound interval, right? Let's just imagine the F sharp is down right here. What kind of interval that we could have identified last week? What is D to F sharp? It's a, what kind of third?
Major.
Major third, that's right. So if the D to this F sharp is a major third, then
Major 10.
that's right, major 10. Let's try one more here. You know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm going to change this one. This one will be better. E flat up to A natural. Identify that compound interval. This looks like a good one I could put on a future test. Say again?
11.
It's an 11, I would agree. Okay, do you know what kind of 11th it is? Number 11s can only be perfect, augmented, or diminished. Do you know?
Is it augmented?
That's right, it's an augmented 11th. Because if I got the A down here, an octave, E flat to A natural, that's an augmented fourth. So because I just have an extra octave of space in there, the quality is the same, it's still augmented, but now it's an 11. Augmented 11. Yes?
Will augmented, or the compound ones have different dissonant and consonants?
No, they have the same dissonance and consonants, because it's just an extra octave of space added in, yeah. So for instance, the 12th is considered consonant, so is the 15th, so is the 10th, so is the 13th, but the 14th would be dissonant, the 9th is certainly dissonant, and I guess it depends on what part of the texture the 11th is found in, whether it's consonant or dissonant, yeah. That's a good question. I think there's only one more task we need to do with this type before I go on to the next topic of intervals. Let's see if you can spell, oh, by the way, the good news is compound intervals are rarely, if ever, inverted. So we're not going to need to be able to have to spell compound intervals below a given note, even though we could. I mean, the procedure is still the same, but I don't think we're going to end up doing any of that. So let's try this. I've got a B down here in the treble clef, and I need to know what note is a major 13th above. A major 13th above a B. Well, I would probably think of, can I find out what note is a major 6th above a B? If I can, then I can just shoot it up an octave and I got my answer.
So that'd be a G sharp, right?
A G sharp, that's right. So a major 6th above the B is going to be this G sharp right here. Put an extra octave of space between the pitches, and that gets your G sharp up here. And voila, you have a major 13th. Does that make sense? It's not too difficult, I don't think, if you know what you're doing. Okay, let's try another one. Here's the pitch F, and I need to know what tone or what pitch is a minor ninth above an F. What's the smaller interval that ninths correspond to?
Can I answer it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it a G flat?
It is, right? You are correct. A ninth correspond to seconds, right? So ask yourself, what note is a minor second above an F? Well, that's going to be the G flat, the half step. So that means the minor ninth will be this G flat. Oh, this one's too easy. I've got the pitch A, as the Fonz would say, right here. And I need to know what pitch is exactly a perfect 15th above that A.
It's an A.
That's right. But is it A4?
No.
Which A is it?
A5.
That's right, it's A5. 2 octaves above. I really think hopefully this will be sufficient to help you understand how to deal with and spell compound intervals. I mean, technically, like when you sing in a choir, generally the basses are a compound interval away from the sopranos, if not sometimes from the altos, technically. But a lot of, like for instance, your choir instructor probably doesn't talk technically about compound intervals. He probably just removes the octave and says, well, there's a third between the basses and the sopranos. Well, we know what that means. It's probably really a tenth, but we understand that. Okay. Good. Any questions before I go on? Then let's shift gears to talk about enharmonic intervals. Enharmonic intervals. Just like notes or pitches in music, intervals can be spelled differently and yet sound the same. So, again, a definition of an enharmonic interval would be any two intervals that sound the same but are spelled differently. They are said to be enharmonic. An example of a pair of enharmonic intervals could be something like this. Here I have an augmented fourth, F up to B, and this interval is spelled differently, but it sounds exactly the same, F up to C flat. If I were to play the first interval, that's the augmented fourth. Here's the second interval, the diminished fifth. So these would be two example of two enharmonic intervals. They're spelled differently, but they sound exactly the same. I could also write the diminished fifth another way. I could write it like this. E sharp up, whoops, I did that wrong. Hang on a second. E sharp up to B. That would be another way to spell the interval differently, but yet it still sounds the same. Okay. Now, there's really only one, I don't want to say rule, but there's really only one truth about to deal with enharmonic intervals, and that is this. If you're asked to respell a given interval enharmonically, all you have to do is respell one of the two pitches of the interval enharmonically. That's all you got to do. Just choose one, pick one of the pitches of the given interval, respell it enharmonically, and poof, your whole entire interval is respelled enharmonically. If you take a look at these two right here, which, in order to go from the augmented fourth to the first diminished fifth, which of these two pitches did I respell enharmonically?
The top one.
Yeah, the B, I just respelled it enharmonically as a C flat. But I left the other note the same, didn't respell it. And to go from this augmented fourth to the second diminished fifth, which of these two notes was respelled enharmonically? Yeah, the bottom one, the F was respelled enharmonically as E sharp. Don't ever respell both pitches enharmonically. Yeah, don't do that. That's just confusing. Just pick one note in the given interval and respell it enharmonically, and you're going to be good. Okay, so you can kind of think of enharmonic intervals as similar to homonyms in language. I know this is, let's see, do I, nope, that's not right. How do I spell homonym?
I think that's right.
Does anyone know what a homonym is? Yeah.
Isn't it like when, you say a word like B, but it's spelled differently?
Yeah, like for
Like
instance,
B-E-E.
yeah, I think you're on the right track. Like, an example of homonyms would be, like for instance, the word here versus the word here. Right? The words sound the same, but they have different meanings and they're spelled different. Okay? So, if you want to think of enharmonic intervals, kind of like that, I guess you could. Respelling an interval enharmonically will always generate a new numeric size, either one smaller or one larger than the original size. Let's go back to this example. When I respelled this augmented fourth enharmonically, I got a new interval size. And the new interval size is always one larger or one smaller than the old interval size. So I went from a fourth here to a fifth. And that will always be true when you respell enharmonic intervals correctly. So let's do some actual examples of enharmonic intervals. You know, I kind of wish there were exercises in your workbook on compound and enharmonic intervals, but there are not for some reason. So I guess I could put that in my stern letter whenever I write to the author. Let's say we start out with an interval that's given to you like this, E flat to C sharp, which is an augmented sixth. Let's respell that interval enharmonically and then identify the new name of the interval. So, how do we do that? Remember I said just choose one of the two pitches and respell that pitch enharmonically. Which one do you want to pick and respell?
Oh, the bottom one, D sharp.
Okay, let's respell the bottom one, E flat. You respell it enharmonically, it will be D sharp. You leave the other note alone. What is my new interval now? Well, we know the size is going to be 1 away from 6. It's going to be, okay, it's definitely a 7. Now you have to do your thinking like you did last week. Does anyone know what kind of 7 D sharp to C sharp is? Should be major, minor, augmented, or diminished. You've got a 25% chance.
Major.
No, it's actually minor. Yeah, it's actually minor 7. D sharp to C sharp. D sharp to C double sharp would be a major 7. It would. How about one like this? C sharp up to B flat. That is a diminished 7th. Maybe I'll give you this one. Tell me how I can respell it as a major 6th. Easy as pie, right? Just choose one of the notes. Which one do you want to respell?
Respell B flat.
The B flat, that'll work. How would you?
As an A sharp.
Yeah, as an A sharp, good. And leave the other note the same. But what if you decided to respell this one? Would it still come out right? Yeah, it would. It still would come out right as a major 6th. For instance, if you decided to respell the C sharp enharmonically and not the B flat, we'd leave the B flat alone, and this would have to be spelled as a D flat. And we still get a major 6th. All right, I think I've got one more. second. And I need someone to help me respell it enharmonically as a diminished third. Guess there's no right or wrong here, as long as you just choose one of the given pitches and respell it enharmonically. You'll get a good answer.
Make the G sharp and A flat.
Okay, let's do it. F sharp, A flat, poof, you've got a diminished third. Do you see how he just chose the top, happened to arbitrarily choose the top pitch, G sharp, and enharmonically respell it as an A flat? That's all you need to do. You can be able to do all that, huh?
Question?
Yeah.
The bottom one, you'd have to make a double sharp then, right?
Yeah, if you respelled the bottom one, F sharp enharmonic is E double sharp. That's right. So E double sharp up to G sharp would be the diminished third. Yep, that's exactly right. Good. Okay. Now, does anyone have any questions on how to respell enharmonically respell an interval? I hope I'm not going too fast for y'all, and at the same time, I hope I'm not going too slow for some of you either. The last thing I need to do is, I'll probably need to turn the TVs on. I want to show you how to get started on section D of workbook page 10. Because it's not necessarily intuitive when you read the instructions, I found. So I need you to open your workbooks up to page 10. And I'll take the last 5 minutes or so of class here to get you going on how to do that. Because your homework is, for next class, is workbook page 10, letter sections D and E. And I think E is pretty self-explanatory, but I don't think section E is all that self-explanatory. Let me just make sure this is just the right feed on it. Like that. Now, basically the instructions are saying label each interval in the melody. Now, what it's asking you to do is, instead of identifying or labeling harmonic intervals, that is, intervals where the two notes sound at the same time, it wants you to label a melodic intervals. That is, the two notes sound at separate times. We talked about a little bit about the difference between a harmonic and a melodic interval. But the method for calculating interval names and sizes is still the same. So for instance, and again I got this frozen, so I'll have to point it out from where I am here. You see the first blank with a number 1 under it is for the interval between the first two notes. B up to D. Does anyone know what that interval is?
A minor third.
It's a minor third, that's right. So in the first blank for number 1, for instance, you would write minor third. The second interval, number 2, that's for the distance between the D half note down to the G sharp quarter note. And it doesn't matter to me if you want to think of it as D down to G sharp, or you could go the other way, G sharp up to D. It's still going to be the same distance, the same interval, whichever is easier for you to think of. I know G sharp up to a D natural, for instance, is a diminished fifth. Okay? So I would put diminished fifth in blank number 2. go on and do the same process for all the rest. There's 24 intervals, melodic intervals to identify this.
For like number 20, are we using it that since it's in the same measure, the sharp carries over?
Yes. Good question. See how number 20 is between the F sharp 16th note and the next 16th note? Well, the next 16th note is also F sharp because it's in the same measure, and accidental carries throughout the entire measure for that same note. I don't know if you guys know that, but that's the truth. So we don't have the second F in that last measure sharp, but it is assumed it's sharp because it's in the same measure, so the sharp carries through, yes.
Is number 10 asking for the interval between the first note in the second bar and the first, or the very last note in the first bar?
Yeah, interval number 10 is the distance interval between the F, the last note up on the top line, and the C, the first note on the next line. F up to C. That's your for interval 10.
If it's augmented first are the only things, there's no diminished first, correct?
That's right. And I forget, where do we get the, what measure? I know there's,
15 and 19.
oh yeah, 15, yeah, and 19, that's right. 15 is the distance between the F sharp at the end of that measure and the F natural at the beginning of the next measure. There's no such thing as a diminished unison, so you can't write that. What's the only other thing besides, it's not a perfect unison, what's the only other option you have?
Augmented.
Augmented unison, that's right. Oh, it says even in the instructions. Interval 10 is from the F4 up to the C5. Huh, how about that? I faced it. Remember that accidental remains in effect until the end of the measure unless it is canceled. Maybe you should have read the instructions. All right, finally, section E, just a comment or two about it. It says beneath each harmonic interval that follows indicate whether it's consonant, dissonant, or dissonant only if the bottom note of the interval is in the bass. So for instance, do you see for the minor third number 1, you've got 3 choices, either C for consonant, D for dissonant, or D dissonant when the bass note is the bottom note of the interval? I don't know, I've had students that really mess this up. It's like they write C and D's and D bass in every single line. I don't know, it's just, some people get really confused. All you have to do is put an X or a check mark in whichever one for that interval. You see what I'm saying? So like a minor third is consonant. So just put a check mark in the top and just leave the other 2 underneath it blank because it's considered a consonant. Does that make sense? Or you could put an X, whatever you want to do. You can even draw a picture. But you only have to check one or mark one blank for each of these intervals, whether they're consonant or dissonant. And which is the only interval that's dissonant when the bottom note is in the bass? The D bass one? Remember from last week?
The fourth.
The fourth. The perfect fourth. That reminds me of.
So for the fourth, do we just put an X in the D bass?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Reminds me of the, well, this is old. Some of you have seen it. You've seen The Little Mermaid, right? And I don't even remember, is his name Sebastian, the crab?
Yeah.
Yeah. He sings a song and he talks about D-bass. That's what I think about when I see it. Well, anyways, okay. Yeah, that's all the time we have for today, so, boy, that time goes really fast. Thank you, and we'll see you when we see you. Yeah. But I've heard about it.
It's like,
Oh, he does? Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, that's good. Oh, that's really good. I like that. Do you have any on the back? Of your-
No, but I have like a ton that I'm gonna be putting in my water bottle when I get it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, sounds good.